There we go. So South Africa's had a pretty turbulent year. We've had Nenegate, we've had Guptagate, fees must fall protests, the Rand remains weak, the ruling party is in the middle of an increasingly vicious internal faction fight, allegations of state capture abound, the risk of a downgrade to junk status still looms large, and violent protests have shut down communities across the country in the run-up to the August elections. Despite these challenges, however, there remains much to be positive about for business working in or looking to invest in the country. But successfully navigating these current challenges is going to be key to doing this successfully. And like never before, this is going to require understanding what's happening politically and socially, and what all of this is likely to mean for the economy. For this briefing, I've chosen 3 political and social areas that I think are going to be key for business looking to successfully navigate the current challenges in South Africa: the current state of democracy, protest strikes and labour relations, and the upcoming elections and the future of the ANC. And what I'll spend the next half hour or so doing is providing a brief overview of the situation for each area, what the most likely scenario is going forward, and what that's going to mean for the economy and for companies doing business in and with South Africa. Okay, so first, the state of South African democracy. So there have been a number of positive blows recently in favour of South African democracy. So the first of these that I'm highlighting is Nenegate, eventually. So as I'm sure many of you know, but for those who don't, on December 9th, 2015, without warning, consultation or explanation, Zuma fired respected Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene and replaced him with David Van Rooyen, a little-known, although reasonably highly qualified, backbencher, and an unpopular former mayor whose house had been burned down by a mob when he was mayor, when they were angry about proposed demarcation changes. Zuma's decision to fire Nene in this way was widely seen as an attack on fiscal prudence and an attempt to capture the treasury. Nene had been trying to rein in South African Airways and was also trying to rein in government spending, for example, by opposing a government plan to procure nuclear energy that he said was not affordable. On the face of it, that doesn't look great for democracy. But after business and civil society protested, the Rand tanked, as did markets, Zuma was forced to fire Van Rooyen and to bring back Pravin Gordhan, who did the job capably between 2009 and 2014, and who has brought back some stability to the South African economy. So I'm arguing that was a positive blow for democracy. It shows that actually the government can't do anything they want. Civil society and business does have some control and influence there. The second positive blow is Nkandla. On the 31st of March 2016, the Constitutional Court delivered a unanimous ruling stating that the Public Protector's report entitled Secure and Comfort, which found that Zuma had benefited unduly from the 246 million rand the state had spent upgrading his Nkandla homestead and requiring him to pay back some of that money. The Constitutional Court found that report was binding and that Zuma and the National Assembly had failed to uphold, defend and respect the Constitution. Okay, this was a significant sign of the independence and strength of the judiciary in South Africa, and also an important legitimisation of the Office of the Public Protector, which is a Chapter 9 institution tasked with the investigation of government misconduct. And the third positive blow that I think has been struck is what's known as the spy tapes. So in April of this year, a High Court in Pretoria ruled that 783 corruption charges against Jacob Zuma that were dropped in 2009 must be reinstated. The court found that the former head of the National Prosecuting Authority acted impulsively and irrationally when he decided to drop the corruption case against Zuma. He decided to do that on the basis that transcripts of telephone conversations between the then Scorpions boss and former MPA boss showed political interference in the timing of the charges that were brought against Zuma. Both the MPA and Zuma since April have sought to appeal the judgment, but just a couple of weeks ago, the North Gauteng High Court dismissed their application with costs in a unanimous ruling. Okay, so there have been a number of very positive blows for South African institutions, but serious concerns remain. Okay, one of these, I think, is that Parliament repeatedly appears to be quite toothless. It's repeatedly failed to hold the executive, and in particular the president, to account. Okay, it was also accused of breaching the constitution in the Nkandla case. And the strength of the ANC within it means that it effectively acts primarily in the ANC's interests, despite vigorous challenges by opposition parties. A second concern, I think, is rampant cronyism and corruption. Okay, government procurement at all levels is now riddled with graft. Public positions are now so lucrative that they are worth killing for. Okay, in 2015, a head teacher was hacked to death and another was shot after they refused to make way for people who had bought their posts. There have also been numerous allegations in recent months about the role of the Gupta family and their influence in government appointments. Cadre deployment, the systematic placement of party loyalists by the ANC into key positions of power, has contributed significantly to the problems faced by the roughly 700 state-owned companies. Afrobarometer data, the most recent round of the Afrobarometer was 2014-2015, suggests that South Africans increasingly think corruption is a significant problem with government, with 63.5% of South Africans feeling corruption has increased a lot in just the last year. And this is well above the African average of 40.6%. And finally, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index for 2015 places South Africa in 61st place, down from 55 in 2009. It's actually a relative improvement from 2014, when South Africa was in 67th place, but the corruption score of 44, which is much lower than you would like, remains the same, which indicates that the rise in from 67 to 61 is just because other countries have got worse, not because South Africa is seen to have got any better. And then there are also continuing and concerning attacks on the checks and balances that exist in the country, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of those. So, in terms of the courts, I think there are two that have particularly worried me over the last year. The first is the Omar al-Bashir case and the kind of outcome of that, which was when Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir was allowed to leave the country despite an arrest warrant from the ICC and an order for his arrest from the South African High Court. And this shows that although, as I discussed moments ago, the judiciary does seem to be independent and quite strong in its independence, the government's not above simply ignoring it when it doesn't want to comply. And we've also had in recent months the resurgence of the Traditional Courts Bill. Now, this is a bill which would create a separate legal system for millions of people living in the former Bantustans, allowing local chiefs to act as judges, prosecutors and mediators with no legal representation and no right of appeal. This was originally mooted quite some time ago, and there was vigorous opposition from civil society, from the judicial system. But government has indicated, I was reading a statement by government about 3 weeks ago, and they have sort of recommitted to introducing it. We don't know in what form it's finally going to come in, but that would significantly undermine the court system and the judicial system if you then end up with this kind of dual legal system in the country. Then there's the attacks on the Office of the Public Protector. So despite the recent Nkandla ruling validating the Office of the Public Protector, there is also evidence that the office is being systematically starved of resources in an attempt to limit its ability to successfully hold government to account. Okay, the office reports a current budgetary shortfall of approximately 45%, and although the DA in recent weeks has come out with a plan to try and increase that budget, there's no movement from government. Government seems to be quite happy leaving it under-resourced. And the public protector, Thuli Madonsela, has also been accused by the ANC of being a counter-revolutionary and a CIA agent. So there are personal attacks on her as well. And finally, the media. And as Stefano mentioned, I used to be a journalist in South Africa, so this is something that I've been watching with interest, but fears are growing over press freedom in South Africa. Freedom House, in its most recent report, reports a 5-year decline in press freedom in the country. Money from a government employees' pension fund was used to help an ally of Zuma buy independent newspapers, South Africa, which is one of the biggest newspaper organisations there. There are increasing reports of public harassment of journalists. Planned legislation, including the controversial Protection of State Information Bill, threatens to prevent journalists reporting on significant issues that the government decides it's in the national interest for them not to, and it gives them broad powers to define what counts as the national interest. In recent weeks, the SABC, under Cloudy, has banned coverage of violent protest action, and it's also banned negative news only within SABC, but it's also banned negative news about Zuma because he deserves a certain degree of respect as president of the country. SABC has also suspended 6 journalists who've expressed their concerns about the strict editorial stance of the broadcaster. And finally, there's also clear and increasing ANC bias in electoral coverage. Media Monitoring Africa reports that the ANC now has 57% of the total media coverage, compared to 38% in 2014. The DA's share has dropped from 25% to 16% over the same period, and the EFF's from 13% to 11%. So what's the outlook in terms of the state of democracy? Well, despite all of the negatives I've just outlined, I actually think the outlook for the state of democracy in South Africa remains mostly positive. The maintenance of a strong, independent judiciary is going to be key in this, and this in turn is going to depend heavily on the outcome of the ANC leadership battle, which I'm going to discuss shortly. The increasingly strong opposition, the DA and the EFF, is also a good sign. And many of the recent successes around Candler and the spy tapes particularly have been brought about by a combination of a strong opposition prepared to turn to the courts and strong independent judiciary prepared to rule against the executive. And as long as South Africa can maintain this, I believe its democratic institutions will endure. So the next area I want to look at is protest strikes and labour relations. And as Stefano mentioned, this is my own personal research area, so I'm going to do my best not to get too carried away and excited and rein myself in. But 2016 is now predicted to see the highest number of protests since the end of apartheid. There's been a general increase, but 2016 we are predicting to be the highest by quite some way. 210, I think, is what I've predicted there, and that's a relatively conservative estimate that doesn't include any of the labour relations protests. And protest types and trends, they largely fall into three categories. Okay, so this first one I'm terming dissatisfaction protests. These are protests around service delivery, dissatisfaction with government policy, and the state of the country. So the recent Fees Must Fall protests, which began in October of last year, are a good example of this, as are the education-related protests in Limpopo, where a number of schools were burnt down. There was also some factional infighting there, but they were also ostensibly about the lack of a decent education service in the region. Okay, so these dissatisfaction protests have increased significantly in the last 18 months, and that's a relatively new trend. Historically, we've usually seen a decrease in these kinds of protests in election years. The dominant theory for this being that in election years, government-citizen dialogue increases, and therefore there are alternative ways for people to make their voices heard. Since 2014, however, my own research has shown a change in this trend. I'm still trying to untangle it a little bit, but my own view is that this is because of increased factional infighting around elections, rather than any sort of increased dissatisfaction. Okay, the second type of protests are political protests, most of which are currently election-related. They've also increased since the start of the year, and the vast majority of them are around candidate selection and factional infighting, mostly within the ANC. And the biggest example of this at the moment has been the Shwani protests over the ANC's mayoral candidate choice, where the ANC announced its mayoral candidate, and for about 6 days, rioters and protesters took to the streets of Shwani, of Pretoria. There were buses burnt, 5 people were killed. It was a particularly violent protest. What seems to be coming out is that it was to do with disgruntled candidates who'd not made it as the mayoral candidate, and that their supporters were fighting. And finally, we have labour protests and strikes. Now, South Africa has one of the highest incidences of global incidences of labour instability. Okay, new data coming out of the University of Johannesburg show that labour protests accounted for almost half, 46%, of all public protests recorded by the police between 1997 and 2013. My own data shows that that's actually increasing as a percentage. We're now slightly above 50%. Currently, in this first half of 2016, labour protests are a little bit more subdued than in previous years. I believe that's partly because of the ratings risk. I think we've seen business, labour and the government come together to work and try and stave off the ratings risk. We also have the lingering effects of the 2014 platinum strike. So platinum is one of the big industries where the wage negotiations are due this year. Both sides are currently putting forward their positions. We're waiting for the negotiations to formally start. But in 2014, they had an incredibly detrimental strike that caused a lot of problems. It shut down the platinum industry for months. And so I think there's still some lingering effects of that, both for the protesters and for the platinum industry, that is making negotiations this year a little bit more subdued. And finally, local elections, I think, are also having an effect because they're absorbing some of the factional fighting that often spills out into labour protests and strikes. All of that said, NUMSA have now declared a dispute in their negotiations with the Retail Motor Industry Organisation, so that the possibility of a strike has just been raised there. And violent clashes between two rival unions, the NUM and the AMCU, at the Zonderrede mine in Limpopo, which have resulted in a number of deaths and physical attacks over the last 2 months, have raised tensions between those two unions, which may have negative effects on the platinum wage negotiations going forward. So what do I think is the outlook in this area? In terms of political and dissatisfaction protests, I think they're likely to continue to August and then decrease slightly, with some exceptions in by-election areas. I'm going to get onto by-elections shortly. I think they're then going to ramp up again in the run-up to the ANC leadership election in 2017 and then the national elections 2019. I don't think they're going away anytime soon. I think we're just going to have a few lull periods. Labour relations, as I said, I think the strikes are likely to be somewhat subdued this year, but the contentious environment is going to continue going forward, and it's likely to worsen again in 2017 and 2019 as a result of increased factional fighting within the ANC and tripartite alliance, as well as increased competition between the ANC and their Labour allies and the EFF and theirs. And now we move on to the big political issue at the moment, the upcoming local elections and the future of the ANC. So local elections are going to be held on August 3rd, 2016, and we've got more than 200 parties and nearly 1,000 independent candidates are standing, which is an increase of 69% over the local elections in 2011. The run-up to these elections has seen a significant upsurge in protests and violence, and as I've already mentioned, I believe that factional politics within the ANC is key to this. In terms of outcomes, the ANC is widely predicted to lose a number of key urban areas to the DA, including Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. The Independent Electoral Commission, which is another Chapter 9 institution like the Public Protector, is also facing a number of challenges from disqualified groups and individuals, which is likely to test its legitimacy, amid accusations by some that it's favouring the ANC, and this may lead to some post-election unrest. Okay, and a few examples of the challenges. The PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, was initially not recognised by the IEC because of a leadership dispute within the PAC. After a High Court ruling, they've actually been allowed to contest the election. The NFP, the National Freedom Party, remains disqualified after failing to pay the required fees, and the EFF are currently talking about fighting and challenging that ruling on the NFP's behalf. And finally, over 8,350 candidates have been disqualified by the IEC. Many of these are independents, some of them are party candidates. But from the communities that I've been working in, and I've been following a number of communities in the run-up to these elections, I know that many of these are planning to challenge the IEC over this. They are accusing the IEC of bias towards the ANC, and they've got backing from groups including NUMSA, who are currently trying to sort of work behind the scenes, gather a group of independent candidates together to mount a challenge to the IEC. So I think that's going to be quite an important move over the next few months. In terms of the outlook, I think the next few months up until the elections, we're going to see continuing violence. I think we're going to see very low turnout at these elections, as many disaffected ANC supporters, rather than voting for the opposition, just choose not to turn out. The urban-rural divide is likely to increase, so the ANC is increasingly becoming a party with its main base of support in the rural areas. And this is happening just as South Africa is becoming increasingly urbanised as a country. So in 1994, slightly more than 51% of South Africans lived in urban areas. It was 63% in 2014, and it's projected to be 74% by 2035. Okay, under the social conservative leadership of Zuma, the ANC is clearly strengthening its rural support base. And they're behaving in ways to sort of strengthen this further. So in the run-up to these local government elections, the salaries of traditional leaders are often seen by the ANC as being able to deliver their community, the votes from their community. Their salaries were increased by 28.4% in mid-2015. And this has been they've had particular salary increases in KwaZulu-Natal, where they have been quite strong under Zuma, but they are concerned going forward. And facing a big challenge from the IFP, and also in the Eastern Cape. Those are two big areas that they've really been targeting with this. sort of the next part of the outcome, I think we're going to see a significant number of by-elections in the later half of this year, many of which are likely to be accompanied by quite violent protests. Among others, the ANC has already admitted that in 20 wards in the Eastern Cape, if it wins them, it will have to immediately ask its councillors to resign and hold by-elections because of problems with the party's candidate nomination protest. I wrote this slide about 3 or 4 days ago, and I've noted about 70 more wards since across the country that have declared the same thing. Okay, so you have a number of wards where even the ANC win, they're immediately going to have to ask their candidate to resign. They're going to want an immediate by-election. Whether the candidates will resign, whether they'll go quietly, whether they'll then challenge as independents is very unclear, but you're likely to see a rise in violence around these. Key urban areas, I agree largely with the polls. I think they're likely to move in the DA's favour, but I think the outcomes are going to be much closer than the media are predicting. And this is because while in Nelson Mandela Bay, where the DA is currently polling ahead of the ANC, and Tshwane, where the DA is only slightly behind, both parties are currently well below the 50% needed to win a metro, and the deciding factor is likely to be disgruntled ANC supporters. At the moment, in the polls, they're reporting that they're unsure if they will support the ANC. But historically, many of those who report they're unsure in the run-up to the elections do actually turn out and vote ANC on the day. The deciding factor is likely to be the number of stayaways. So the number of disgruntled ANC voters who decide they're not going to go out and vote for the ANC. Okay, so moving on to the future of the ANC. I think there's little doubt that the support for the ANC is beginning to and is going to continue to decrease. But the future of the ANC rests heavily on the outcome of the current very public struggle for power between two competing factions of the ANC. I'm going to very quickly try and outline how I see that. So on the one hand, you have what I'm calling the traditionalists. Okay, this is a group of politicians. They tend to be loyal to Zuma. They endorse socially conservative, highly redistributive policies and are in favour of a centralised state. They tend to be paternalistic and insiders. Okay, some examples of these would be Zuma, the so-called Premier League, which are the influential leaders of three largely rural provinces under ANC control, the Free State, Mpumalanga and the Northwest, as well as a large faction of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province where traditionalists have recently gained ascendancy again with the removal of Mchunu as premier. It also includes potential presidential aspirant Baleka Mbete, the Speaker of the House, and Dlamini Zuma, although she has not come out in favour of this group, appears to be favoured by this group. And it's generally seen to be in favour of what is referred to as the National Democratic Revolution, which is a very fuzzily used phrase, which generally indicates an intent to undertake radical economic transformation. On the other hand, there are the reformers. These tend to be urban, more committed to inclusive economic growth as the driver of future empowerment, outsiders who are excluded from current patronage networks. Some examples of this is the largest part of the ANC in Gauteng province, and this is the Gauteng province ANC faced the most likely threat of losing their majority positions and influence to the opposition in the 2019 elections. The Eastern Cape, a faction within the Eastern Cape, who lost out when previous Xhosa influence in the ANC was replaced by Zulu with the ascendancy of Zuma, and minority ANC factions in a number of other provinces. It's most associated with the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, and Cyril Ramaphosa. The SACP and Cosatu, who supported Zuma in his rise against Mbeki, have now come out in support of Ramaphosa, so they're beginning to move into this group as well. And it's considered the group is ideologically in favour of what's known as the 1996 Class Project, which is a phrase used to indicate pursuit of a neoliberal pro-market agenda. So this struggle for power has been going on for some time, but it's going to become increasingly vicious in the run-up to the election in 2017 of the new ANC leader. In terms of an outlook, I think it's incredibly unlikely Zuma will leave before the end of his term. I don't think either side within the ANC believes that would be a positive outcome. I think the most likely scenario in 2017 is that we'll see Zuma replaced by a compromise slate of traditionalists and reformers. I'm very sceptical that Ramaphosa, despite being favoured by business and increasingly by Labour, actually has the strength within the party to be elected as leader as things stand. This may change, but currently I think the traditionalists still have the ability to block that a little bit. And I think if we get this compromise slate, factional fighting within the party is going to continue. And that's going to affect the economy with attendant policy uncertainty. We're going to continue to see these changes in ministerial appointments as different factions gain and lose in strength, and also because of disagreements between different government departments controlled by different factions. We've seen that over immigration policy, for example, where some factions are supported by the reformers and see immigration and open borders as positive for the economy, and other departments are dominated by the traditionalists and have a much more negative view of immigration. And immigration policy has vacillated between the two. So economically, the result of this is likely to be policy vacillation and investor uncertainty. And I think growth will likely remain weak, but positive. There is also the high possibility of a factional breakaway, something we know the ANC are acutely aware of. And historically, this is quite common within the ANC. We had the PAC split in the 1950s, COPE in 2008 as a result of the Mbeki Zuma fight, and the EFF in 2013 following the ousting of Malema from the ANC. But a factional split between the traditionalists and reformers has the potential to be a particularly large one, with many leading ANC figures warning the party could effectively implode as a result. A factional split would also significantly change the political landscape for the 2019 elections. And finally, a compromise slate is likely to see the party continue to become increasingly rural, and I am predicting that it could well lose its majority by 2024, potentially even earlier if we see a significant factional split in 2018. So coming on to the final section, what does all of this mean for the economy? There are a number of very positive things supporting the South African economy at the moment. Okay, despite Nenegate, South Africa has a widely respected finance minister. As I've already discussed, I think it has a strong democracy with institutions that will actually endure. It's got sophisticated financial markets, respect for property rights. It's an important gateway to the rest of the continent. Demographically, it has a potentially low number of young and old to working age. And business, labour and government does appear to have been working more successfully together in recent months, a fact noted by the rating agencies in their June reviews. There are a number of things that raise concern, however. Despite being widely respected, Pravin Gordhan has a contentious relationship with the Zuma faction within the ANC. So there are persistent rumours that he will be, maybe, is under threat of being arrested over the so-called rogue spy unit established at the South African Revenue Services during his time there. We've seen increased and increasing state spending. Over the past 15 years, state spending has increased from 23% of GDP to 29%, and 1 in 5 working people now works for the government. Significant infrastructure and water challenges, infrastructure particularly Eskom and the provision of electricity, and drought, which has led the agricultural sector to contract sharply. And World Bank estimates this has left 50,000 new South Africans in poverty. As I'm sure Peter's going to discuss in a few minutes, there's also quite an uncertain policy environment at the moment, with a raft of potentially troubling laws on the horizon. We have the continued risk of a rating downgrade. We have weak growth and high unemployment. Unemployment is currently at 26.7%, which is above what was expected by the markets, who expected about 25.3%, and it's the highest reading since September 2005. In terms of growth, the economy contracted by 1.2% in the first quarter of 2016, and the World Bank has now revised South Africa's annual growth forecast to 0.6%, down 0.8 percentage points from the January projection. And we also, as I've discussed, contentious labour relations and increasing dissatisfaction and protests. In terms of the outlook, I believe, therefore, that there is likely to be significant policy uncertainty and continued weak growth in the near future. And a rating downgrade to junk status remains highly likely, perhaps especially in the light of Brexit. But for companies with a longer-term view, I think the institutional strength continues to make South Africa an attractive investment destination, just one that requires some careful navigating in the immediate future. Now, I did anticipate that Brexit might come up. I think I'm probably out of time, and we'll pass on to Peter, and perhaps we can come back to Brexit in questions. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that very enlightening, somewhat depressing overview of the South African political and economic environment. I'm going to talk about some of the regulatory developments in South Africa, which are relevant, I think, to investment in the country. And I thought I would start by quoting something President Kennedy said in 1962, although there's some debate about whether he was accurate about his understanding of Mandarin. He said, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. And I think that does, in many respects, sum up South Africa and actually touch on what Sarah's talked about this morning. So just in terms of talking about the investment environment, I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the termination of South Africa's bilateral investment treaties with the European Union and the European Free Trade Association, a very topical subject in the wake of Brexit. The Protection of Investment Act, the draft international arbitration bill, and then I also want to talk about some of the, I think, relevant developments around the amendments to the mining code in South Africa and the mining charter and what President Zuma has done about those issues. So without further ado, I just thought I would start off though by touching on the whole, and it really also relates to what Sarah said, the whole investment framework and the environment in South Africa. And you'll see with the what is really the implosion of the commodity boom after August 2011, how FDI in Africa has declined, while in Egypt and in Angola it's gone up quite considerably. In South Africa and other mining jurisdictions such as Mozambique and Ghana, FDI declined in South Africa in the last year by over 30%, in Mozambique by 24%, and Ghana by 5%. And that is a real challenge to South Africa. So put that in more specific context. I put some of the figures up here. FDI has declined in South Africa considerably in the last year. It's the lowest in 10 years, 69% lower than it was in 2014, and 79% lower than it was in 2013. But the interesting thing about South Africa's FDI figures, and I think this does create some opportunities, is that South Africa is now a net capital exporter to the rest of the world, in particular to Africa. So it's now a net capital exporter with $125 billion of inward FDI stock compared with $163 billion of outward FDI stock. So that really is a change in the foreign direct investment situation in South Africa, and that creates its own challenges and also its own opportunities. So just talking about the legal aspect of these things, and this is where it touches on what Sarah said as well, where the ideology of the Zuma administration really comes to the fore. Many of you will know this, but when President Mbeki and President Mandela were running the country, South Africa signed 45 bilateral investment treaties and ratified about half of these. In 2006, 2008, when South Africa was driving the whole idea of an African common market, and particularly a common market in the Southern African Development Community, South Africa signed up to the SADC Protocol on Finance and Investment, which effectively gives you bilateral investment treaty type protection without a bilateral investment treaty. And that protocol came into force in 2010. But in 2009, Zuma had just become president, following an exit claim against South Africa, which I was involved in, involving the mining code. So the government decided to start terminating its bilateral investment treaties and would then replace them with a model BIT. And in fact, SADC did that in 2012. But then very inexplicably, and this I think shows the policy incoherence in the government, instead of following through on the model BIT, South Africa unilaterally terminated its BITs with Belgium, Italy, Austria, Denmark, the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and a number of other EU countries. Obviously, Switzerland's not one of them, but it's a member of EFTA. But basically, all the EU BITs were terminated over a 2-year period. So the government then said, well, we'll put something in their place, and what they then offered investors, I'm afraid, was very weak protection, which was the Protection of Investment Act, which was passed last December, and I was involved in some of the parliamentary hearings on it. But one of the problems with this act, or was in a bill last year, is that all it does is give foreign investors the same sort of protection that domestic investors would obtain. So in fact, foreign investors outside of the BIT are now much worse off. Obviously, those BITs have long tails, so they typically, once they're terminated, continue for another 10 to 20 years in the case of the UK BIT. But I mean, I have to say, it's not a positive development. The only ray of light is that the SADC protocol remains in force, so investors would have recourse to international arbitration and the protections under that, as long as that protocol, South Africa continues to maintain it. So I also want to talk about the international arbitration bill in that context. About 15, 16 years ago, the South African Law Commission, under the former Chief Justice, proposed that South Africa should sign up to the ICSID Convention, which is the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, the Washington Convention. Also proposed that South Africa fully ratify the New York Convention on the recognition of enforcement of arbitral awards, and that South Africa should sign up to the UNCITRAL model law. What then happened, because of this whole debate about the bilateral investment treaties, is the government never implemented the Law Commission's recommendations. So effectively the bill that the Commission had proposed remained dormant. But this is one ray of light, is that earlier this year, in April, in fact, the Cabinet approved a draft international arbitration bill, which would in fact domesticate the UNCITRAL model law and the New York Convention in South African law. But this is the downside, because of the government's obsessiveness about international arbitration. It excludes the Washington Convention. So South Africa will not sign the ICSID Convention. So if you want to sue South Africa, you would have to proceed under the additional facility, which is what investors have done so far. So that I think is a step forward, but the step backward is the fact that the BITs have been terminated, and the Protection of Investment Act is, I think, not terribly effective. But the Cabinet said when they proposed this bill that the international arbitration process is an essential tool for doing business across the borders of the country, and will improve access to justice in the country. So I think from that point of view, that's a positive. Now I want to talk about the mining regime in South Africa, which is obviously a very complex terrain, and I'm going to try and simplify things and as much as I can. Clearly, I mean, the end of the commodity boom in 2011 has had a huge impact on South Africa. And you can see on the graph, it's not difficult to read, but you see how commodity prices affect South African GDP. And once commodity prices imploded after 2011, what happened? In fact, it's very interesting. I'm looking at some figures in preparing this talk. South African commodity prices of South Africa's major mineral commodities increased by 500% between 2003 and 2011, and they've now fallen by nearly half since the end of that. So South African mineral exports were $37 billion, and now down to $20 billion, just to give you some indication of that. And obviously that's had a huge impact on employment in the mining industry, which is down something like 50,000 in the last 3 years, and obviously on the mining companies themselves. So just to talk about the law, though, and Sarah did touch on this, South Africa has a mining code which was passed in 2002, came into force in 2004. It put minerals under state custodianship, which was quite a controversial issue back then. But one of the problems with this mining code is the degree of discretion it gives to regulators around mining rights. In 2010, the mining charter, which had been promulgated in 2002, was replaced by the then Minister of Mineral Resources with a much stricter charter, which effectively elevated the charter to be a source of law, which was never the intention behind the original charter, which was really supposed to be a policy instrument. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But in 2014, before the last election, the Parliament passed an amendment to the mining code, which would effectively replicate what the mining charter had done in 2010, which would be to give the charter legislative status and the minister the power to amend it. And this is the most controversial part. It also allowed the minister to designate minerals for domestic beneficiation at a mine gate price, and would not allow mining companies to export those minerals without the minister's permission. You don't have to be a trade lawyer to realize that sets off a lot of red lights, because basically what you're doing is creating an export licensing regime for minerals, and you're interfering between mining companies' ability to sell their minerals into the international market. I'm pleased to say, as a result of work I and others did in 2014, the President, and this is, I think, a sign of the strength of South African institutions, referred the bill back, refused to sign it, and sent the bill back to Parliament for constitutional correction. And the President said that he thought that the amendments around the mining charter violated the rule of law, which I think is positive, and more particularly the proposed amendments around export restrictions and ministerial permission violated the WTO GATT agreement, which effectively amounted to an export license. So that bill is still in Parliament. Just coming back to the mining charter, I know this is all very, very detailed, but there was a positive development last year over the mining charter. Over the whole issue of once empowered, always empowered, and we can talk about that during questions. The then minister and the mining industry agreed to send the mining charter, this debate over the mining charter, to court for a declaratory order as to how the once empowered, always empowered principle would apply. And what that principle really encompasses is that mining companies either have to comply with black economic empowerment on an ongoing basis, or once they empower their black shareholders, there's no longer any requirement to continue empowering them. Unfortunately, that agreement back in March last year then fell apart, because the Department of Mineral Resources then produced an audit saying that most of the mining companies were in breach of their mining charter requirements, and so the Chamber of Mines then decided to go to court for their own declaratory order. And then a further development, which is not positive, is that it's alleged by the media anyway, that the then minister was then replaced by somebody who's close to the Gupta family, a provincial minister of agriculture, who suddenly became the mines minister. And this minister, in April this year, has now published a third version of the mining charter, which abolishes the once empowered, always empowered principle, which is the subject of the court case, requires mining companies to make substantial changes to their ownership structures, and changes all the targets for procurement, employment equity, community development, and other commitments. You can imagine that put the industry very much on the back foot. And the industry since then has been involved in very detailed negotiations with the government around this, the outcome of which is likely to be known this month. Just on I do want to wrap up these comments now. We could talk more during questions. As I say, the government and the industry have been trying to reach some agreement on a more acceptable version of the mining charter. At the same time, late last year, Government, Labour and Business embarked on a project called Operation Pakisa, which would be to identify and unlock constraints to investment and growth in the industry and come up with a shared vision for the mining industry. I think that's positive. The negative is that the outcome of that Operation Pakisa has never been published, because I understand there's resistance to it from the trade unions, despite having been part of the discussion. And then on the MPRDA Amendment Bill, which I talked about a moment ago, I think this is quite significant. About a month ago, the African National Congress's National Executive Committee, which is quite unusual for them to be expressing a view on this, said that the mining charter should not form part of the mining code. So in other words, they've effectively addressed the President's first constitutional reservation. And secondly, about 6 weeks ago, the Mineral Resources Committee in Parliament, in a stroke of independence, said that the committee should obtain an independent legal opinion on the international trade law implications, the bill's beneficiation provisions. So that addresses the second reservation that President Zuma had. So, I mean, I think those are positive developments in a rather murky regulatory environment. So just finally, just to say, I mean, just to tie up with what I said at the beginning, obviously oil and metal prices are now 50 to 70% lower than they were at the height of the boom in 2011. That's obviously created a lot of pressure on the South African economy, and that's also been a factor in the ratings downgrades which South Africa's experienced. And I think that's been a wake-up call, actually, to the South African government that they can't carry on muddling along on these issues of very important regulatory certainty. So I think, hopefully, this will encourage government to take a more pragmatic approach and a less ideological approach to the mining industry, and really follow what's happened in Botswana, which is always rated as having the best mining code in Africa, where there's very little discretion, where time limits are clear, there's very little administrative discretion, and it's a predictable regulatory environment, and you know, move towards a more efficient and effective system for licensing decisions, and provide security of tenure to mining companies, some of which has been lacking in recent times. So those are my comments on the regulatory environment. Thank you very much.